Formula 1 returns this weekend to the Hungarian Grand Prix at the Hungaroring, and often people forget this is now one of the oldest circuits on the F1 calendar, having hosted a GP every year since 1986. In fact, only Monza, Monaco, Silverstone, Spa, Montreal, or the Circuit de Villeneuve, Interlagos, and the infamous Nürburgring have hosted more F1 races than Magyar Nagadic. It's seen some iconic moments around the venue throughout its time in the sport. In fact, pretty much every race, when you look back through history, has had at least one memorable moment. But today we're going to be going through and ranking my top 5 Hungarian Grand Prix in the sport, because I think often nowadays people associate this circuit with kind of being Monaco without the barriers, being very, very difficult to overtake at. And actually, when you look back through its history, especially with rain predicted this weekend, we could be in for quite a special one. First up though is going to be my honourable mention to the 1997 event, of course known entirely for Damon Hill's near miss with the unlikely Arrows team. After getting sacked by Williams whilst winning the 1996 Formula 1 World Championship, Hill moved to Arrows for 1997 in what was kind of touted as a Formula 1 super team. They had a new Yamaha engine coming in, they had a lot of new personnel joining the team ready for the season, and it was meant to be Arrows' big opportunity to try and move to the top of the F1 world. And whilst Michael Schumacher, who of course was Damon Hill's old rival, and his old teammate in Jacques Villeneuve battled for the title throughout the course of the season, prior to the Hungarian Grand Prix, Damon had scored 1 point all season back at Silverstone a couple of races before. The car was pretty unreliable, quite underpowered, but it wasn't a bad package through the corners. So the team knew, on a circuit that is often described as being similar to Monaco, that the Hungaroring would be a golden opportunity for them to finally get a good result. He would qualify third on Saturday afternoon behind the championship pair. He would immediately jump Jacques Villeneuve into turn 1, and then by lap 6 he got the move done on Michael Schumacher and just began to streak into a lead. This was something that we had not seen Arrows do all season, and it finally looked like the work, the money, the investment that Hill and the team had pulled off was finally going to show some fruits for their labour. Hill proceeded to dominate the next 68 laps of the event, and then with just 3 laps to go, catastrophe would befall them. A hydraulic pump failure, he would be stuck in 3rd gear with limited throttle usage throughout the first few laps. Jacques Villeneuve would be closing in at a rate of over 10 seconds a lap, and despite trying to swerve at the Williams inside the final 2 laps when Jacques tried to go for the move, Damon was sadly completely powerless, and to this day, Arrows still hold the record in Formula 1 for the most races entered without ever taking a Grand Prix victory. This would be the closest they ever got inside Formula 1. Now, like I said, this one is my honourable mention because ultimately, yes, although this one moment is very, very memorable, there wasn't really a lot else that happened in that Grand Prix. Hill had honestly absolutely dominated it. I'm sure it's probably remembered as well as it is because he didn't win. And obviously that huge potential upset that never ended up happening was probably a bigger storyline than if he had won the Grand Prix. Whereas every other race inside our top 5 has drama from start to finish, from the front of the grid all the way to the back. In at number 5 then is going to be the 2021 Grand Prix, where Valtteri Bottas went bowling. The Hungarian race, of course, normally slots in right before the F1 summer break, and that normally means, you know, if we've got a good championship fight going on or something like that, drivers want to get as good a result as they can so they can go into the summer with a bit of confidence behind them, a bit of momentum behind them as well, and that is really, really important, especially in 2021. It was one of the closest championship fights we'd ever seen in the sport. Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton, after their contact at the British Grand Prix just one weekend before, the Dutchman had just an 8-point World Championship lead heading into this weekend. Of course, tension was still very, very high from that accident the week before, but this time round it would be Valtteri Bottas that would cause the chaos. Mercedes locked out the front row, but in tricky wet conditions at the start of the Grand Prix, Bottas would lose a handful of places on the run down in towards turn 1. He would then be caught out by Lando Norris, who admittedly broke at pretty much the right time. Even looking back now to record this video, I'm not quite sure what Bottas was attempting to do. He would slam into the back of the McLaren car, which would kind of set up a weird pinball effect in towards turn 1. Norris, who had no control over his car, would slide into both Red Bulls at the first corner. Max Verstappen would pick up huge side pod damage, completely ripping off a lot of the barge board on one side of his car, but was able to continue the race, admittedly very, very slowly. Lando Norris, Valtteri Bottas, Sergio Perez, they would all be out of the Grand Prix at turn 1. And let's not forget Lance Stroll also wiped out Charles Leclerc in a separate accident at the start of that race, because even when there's chaos going on, Lance Stroll always finds a way to kind of get himself into the picture as well by doing something stupid. The red flag was immediately called out. There was carnage, there was debris, carbon fibre, absolutely everywhere around the circuit, and after nearly an hour's worth of cleanup, it would be Lewis Hamilton that would lead the field out on the second formation lap. But as the race got ready to go green flag racing again, every single car dived into the pit lane except one. That was Lewis Hamilton in his Mercedes. Of course, I'm sure if you've been a Formula 1 fan for any notable amount of time now, you will remember that shot of obviously the 5 red lights coming on the grid and there just being one car at the start. Hamilton would have to do one of the weirdest starts of his life, race back around to the pit lane as everybody else had already moved on to dry tyres. He would then make his pit stop at the end of lap 1, re-emerge right towards the rear of the field, and would have to try and fight his way back through from the back of the pack. And it ultimately was his old teammate in Fernando Alonso, who was racing for Alpine, that would put on a lion's defence against the Mercedes to help his teammate Esteban Ocon score his one, and to this day, only Formula 1 victory. This race was quite chaotic, especially at turn 1, especially with the championship permutations. But if you watched a lot of the Grand Prix, it didn't have the most on-track action or anything like that. It was very much dramatic, kind of in the bigger picture, if you will. And of course, who can forget as well, Sebastian Vettel, a brilliant drive, only to get disqualified after the race for failing to provide a fuel sample. In at number 4, I've picked the 2003 Grand Prix, where Ferrari had an absolute stinker. The 2003 F1 season saw 3 teams still battling for the World Championship when we returned to the Hungaroring: Michael Schumacher with Ferrari, Juan Pablo Montoya for Williams, and Kimi Räikkönen for McLaren. All 3 were still in the hunt, but it would be Fernando Alonso, simply put, that would absolutely steal the show this weekend. He took pole by quarter of a second in a Renault car that was decent, but up to that point hadn't been a competitive race winner. It was just very, very good around the twisty switchback sections of the Magyar Nagadic circuit. But yeah, pole for Fernando Alonso. Honestly, turn 1, he just walked away from the rest of the field and nobody really saw him. After that, it was kind of everything going on behind Fernando that made this race far more interesting, and most notably was Ferrari's strategy blunders. Now, Ferrari messing up strategy in modern Formula 1 is something that we see, to be honest, most race weekends. As a Lewis Hamilton fan, I've now had to kind of bear the brunt of that and the realisation in 2025. But in the early 2000s, Ferrari were the benchmark for efficiency and precise, accurate pit calls, as we saw so often back in the day. In fact, Michael Schumacher, of course, the Hungaroring, not a track that's known for overtaking, managed to win on a 3-stop strategy in 1998. But on this day in 2003, Ferrari could not get it right. The German would end up coming home a lapped P8, one of the very few times during his era of dominance between 2000 and 2004 that we didn't see the German at the very least on the podium. P8, luckily for that year for him, would net him 1 World Championship point, but things would be even worse for his teammate Rubens Barrichello, who suffered a catastrophic suspension failure with a scary crash in towards turn 1. The rear left tyre getting completely blown off the side of the car, and he would just skate off into turn 1 at massively high speed. There is so much though that you could talk about from this Grand Prix. Again, V10, powerful but kind of light Formula 1 cars that you know, they were just great to drive. They really did work around a circuit like the Hungaroring. There's overtaking everywhere. Ralf Schumacher would line up on the front row, spin on lap 1, and still recover to, I believe it was P4, come the checkered flag. And honestly, I would recommend, even as a newer Formula 1 fan, going back, sitting down, watching this Grand Prix. If ever there was an argument that we need smaller F1 cars back in the sport, I think this race goes to show it. Number 3, I have picked the 2015 Grand Prix, where Sebastian Vettel claimed victory for Ferrari. Just like the year prior, Mercedes had dominated the early stages of the 2015 season. Vettel had won the second race at Malaysia, and that had kind of given Mercedes a bit of a wake-up call. They started bringing more and more upgrades to the car, and Hamilton and Rosberg had, up to that point, won every other race so far that season. However, the Hungarian Grand Prix was one of just 3 races in 2014 that Mercedes didn't win. We'll be talking about that race in a little while, but that would be a feat that was repeated in 2015. For some reason, Mercedes just couldn't win this venue in the early turbo hybrid era. The weekend, though, it's important to remember, started with a very somber tone, as the F1 world was devastated by the loss of Jules Bianchi, who had been taken off his critical life support earlier in the week. Of course, Jules had had a massive crash at the Japanese Grand Prix the year prior, and the doctors just didn't feel he was making any kind of progress, and his family decided, you know, it was only fair, rather than keeping him alive for the sake of it, they decided, that he would be kind of allowed to die peacefully ultimately there. So heading into the weekend, there was already quite, a big dark cloud over the Formula 1 world. Obviously, this had been the first fatality in the sport since Ayrton Senna in 1994. And during the build-up to the Grand Prix as well, Ferrari did talk a lot about, Jules was very much at the front of their plans in the very near future. He was going to be a Ferrari driver not too far down the line. It was rumoured he was going to be replacing Kimi Raikkonen for 2017, but Ferrari have never gone that far in kind of confirming whether there was too much truth to that. Mercedes, though, would claim a front row lockout when the competitive action got going, but it would be Sebastian Vettel and teammate Kimi Raikkonen who would jump both of them at the start of the race after an uncharacteristically slow start for the Silver Arrows. Hamilton would then make a mistake at the chicane on lap 1 and be down to 10th place by the time he got back round to the start-finish line. Mercedes ultimately not enjoying as dominant a car as they had in the year before on raw pace, spent a lot of the day trying to fight back through the field as Sebastian Vettel and Ferrari tried to control the pace at the front, when suddenly on lap 49 Nico Hülkenberg would suffer a massive front wing failure. Actually quite reminiscent to Barrichello's incident 12 years prior, where the wing would basically get trapped under the car and he would just go straight on down at turn 1. It actually was why the Hungaroring, they had to reprofile a lot of the curbs ready for the year after, because that was deemed as the reason for the fault. During the restart, though, Hamilton would then collide with Daniel Ricciardo's Red Bull and got a drive-through penalty for the incident. It was a little bit reckless by Lewis, but honestly, I still think looking back now was probably a little bit of an extreme penalty. Ricciardo then would attempt an overtake on Nico Rosberg and proceed to have even more contact with another Mercedes, giving the German a puncture, but somehow the Red Bull did hang on. And obviously, with Ricciardo helping take both Mercedes out of the win, Sebastian Vettel would cruise to victory with Daniel Kvyat and Daniel Ricciardo in second and third. It would mark the first time in the entire turbo hybrid era that neither Mercedes car would finish on the podium. And again, this was one of those races where there were battles going on absolutely everywhere, right from the start to the finish. A lot of good wheel-to-wheel racing. I firmly believe we don't look back kind of fondly enough at kind of the 2014 to 2016 Formula 1 cars. They were still quite small, they were incredibly powerful and quite difficult to drive. I think that's the formula F1 need to be going back with if they want to try and kind of continue with these turbo hybrids in the future. Sebastian Vettel, though, crossing the line, would dedicate his victory to Jules Bianchi.
Et merci Jules, cette victoire est pour toi. You will always be in our hearts. We know that sooner or later Jules would have been a part of this team.
And for Ferrari, for the F1 world, this was a very, very welcomed win. And I'm sure Jules, wherever he was enjoying watching it as well. Number 2 then, I have picked the 2006 race where Jenson Button took his long-awaited first Formula 1 victory. 2006, as we've said throughout a lot of these so far, was another iconic season, a big championship battle going down between Michael Schumacher and a resurgent Ferrari going up against Fernando Alonso, who of course, took his first victory here just a few years prior. But the Hungarian Grand Prix saw, one of the most unlikely winners of all time. Jenson Button and Honda had a decent car in 2006. It was kind of Ferrari and Renault right at the top, and then Honda and McLaren not too far behind. When they got the car right, they could fight for victories, but usually it was Renault and Ferrari stealing the show up at the front of the order. However, Jenson had a bit of a disaster. They needed a new engine after qualifying P4, so he would take an instant 10-place grid penalty, but luckily for him, Michael Schumacher had only ended up in P11, and Fernando Alonso had qualified down in P15 for the Grand Prix, so Jenson was going to be starting in and amongst the two guys that we still thought were going to be fighting for victory. Come race day though, on Sunday, the heavens had opened across the Hungarian circuit, and rather staggeringly, I didn't know this until I was researching for this video, it was the first ever wet Hungarian Grand Prix. Now of course, since then, we've had quite a few in the sport. You know, it's looking like this weekend we could get another one at the time of recording, but this was the very first wet Hungarian GP, and it was absolute chaos. It was a complete unknown for the drivers. Michael Schumacher had an absolute disaster after running very, very competitively early on. Both Michael, Fernando and even Jenson Button, they carved their way through the order, making up a lot of places very early on. By just lap 7, Fernando Alonso would already be ahead of Schumacher, because that was mainly down to the tyre war that was going on. Michelin rubber was absolutely the tyre choice to have that weekend. Bridgestone, who basically provided tyres, I believe, for Ferrari, Toyota and the backmarkers, their tyres were useless. Ferrari couldn't do anything, Schumacher couldn't do anything, and the Michelin rubber was absolutely the one you wanted. By the time Kimi Raikkonen and Pedro Della Rosa had pit in their McLaren cars, Fernando Alonso was already up into the lead of the Grand Prix. That's just how quick that Renault was that weekend. But Jenson Button was chasing him down. He was still kind of sat behind him. He'd used Alonso to kind of try and get through a lot of the cars earlier on in the GP, and he was up to a net P2 in the Grand Prix as well. However, this would be where the race again would get completely turned on its head. After Alonso came in for his pit stop, unfortunately the team forgot to put the right rear wheel on correctly, and as he made his way down in towards turn 2, the wheel would fly off the car, Alonso would be sent spinning into the wall, and that would be the end of his hopes during the Grand Prix. And that meant Jenson Button, seemingly out of nowhere, was up into the lead. We saw incidents later on as well between Kimi Raikkonen trying to get around some back markers and a lot of other things going on, combined with Michael Schumacher's massive struggles. Button, once he got into the lead, he never looked back, simply put, and obviously when you think about this race, or at least when I do, you've always got to remember that iconic James Allen commentary as Jenson Button came around the final corner to finally claim his first Formula 1 victory.
In his 113th Grand Prix start, he's proved the critics wrong. They said he might never win a Grand Prix. He's done it! Jenson Button wins the Hungarian Grand Prix! Get in there!
This set off a really good run of form for JB towards the end of the year. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, from this race to the end of the year, he actually outscored both Alonso and Michael Schumacher. And it looked like Honda could have been real championship threats in 2007 had they not completely messed up the car. Of course, Jenson would get his redemption with a World Championship back in 2009, but for a long time it really looked like this might be the only win of his Formula 1 career. Again, this was just another fantastic example of no matter where you look, there was action going on. And again, it's another race that I would highly recommend going back and watching. Last but not least then, in number 1, we have picked the 2014 Hungarian Grand Prix, which I've called the original Mercedes disaster. As previously mentioned, during the early stages of the turbo hybrid era, Mercedes absolutely dominant. The 2014 car was ridiculously quick compared to everybody else. Nobody could touch them on really Saturday in qualifying or race day Sunday, and heading into the Hungaroring weekend, I think they were expecting to win again. They'd only lost one race so far in 2014. That was back in Montreal, where after some rear brake issues, Ricciardo jumped Rosberg with just 2 laps to go. But it was Lewis Hamilton that started the weekend with an absolute disaster. His Mercedes engine were catch fire in qualifying before he ever got to start a run, which would mean he'd be starting the race from the rear of the field. Rosberg would take pole, so Lewis knew the pressure was on heading into the Grand Prix, and proceeded to crash immediately at turn 2 on the very first lap, just struggling on the slippery surface after more rain had fallen on the circuit. Hamilton would have to box for a new front wing and try to start recovering his Grand Prix. Hamilton, though, would get a little bit of luck later on in the GP when on lap 9 Marcus Ericsson would have a rather nasty crash, bringing out a safety car that would force all the drivers to pit and all box onto dry compound and basically just bring the whole field a lot closer together. But he did really screw over Nico Rosberg, Sebastian Vettel and I believe Fernando Alonso, who, when the safety car was called, had just gone past the pit lane entry line. This worked out fantastically though for Canadian Grand Prix winner Daniel Ricciardo, who took the lead after the top 3 had been able to make their pit stops. And then, rather bizarrely, the Toro Rosso of Jean-Eric Vergne, up in P4, having the race of his life, Rosberg couldn't overtake him. This is just how difficult the Hungarian GP circuit is to overtake at sometimes. Rosberg, on a drying track where there was just one dry line, couldn't do anything to get past the Toro Rosso, and that meant as Hamilton was slowly carving his way back through the order, closing back in, the gap to Rosberg was coming down and down as Hamilton was getting through and overtaking more and more cars. Rosberg then, in a desperate attempt to try and get out from being behind the Toro Rosso, would dive into the pit lane on lap 30, and then immediately Hamilton would go from the hunter back to the hunted. Of course, later on in the race, Rosberg closed back in on him. They were both trying to go to the end of the race. The team would request that Lewis jump out of the way for Nico so he could try and chase the cars down in front. And Hamilton basically told the team, look, if Nico wants to get past me, he can overtake me. There was still quite a lot of unrest within the team after the incident that happened during the Monaco qualifying session a few race weekends prior, that had already kind of damaged the relationship between Lewis and Nico Rosberg, and this was just another tear kind of in that inner team rivalry where they knew they were only battling each other for the World Championship crown. Late on in the race, Rosberg would pit again, and after Fernando Alonso had been able to take the lead of the Grand Prix in a woeful 2014 Ferrari car, Daniel Ricciardo would carve his way back through. Brilliant overtakes around the outside of Lewis Hamilton down at turn 2. A huge dive bomb on Alonso at turn 1 to steal the victory with just a handful of laps remaining. And that would deny Alonso his only real shot of victory in 2014, and Ferrari would end up going winless. For Daniel Ricciardo, it would be his second of 3 victories that season. He would go on to win the first race after the summer break at Spa-Francorchamps as well. But this race for me just topped the list. Not only was there a lot of on-track action going on, but also this kind of overlooming Mercedes rivalry as well between Hamilton and Rosberg that really just took up to another level. It was a brilliant race, there was a lot going on, and it was one that I think, if I could go back and watch for the first time again, I would absolutely love to see. It went to show that, Mercedes couldn't completely control both of their drivers at all times. It showcased as well that despite not having mechanical issues, Mercedes could still be beaten when they kind of got a little bit hot under the collar. It would have been a massive victory if Alonso had won. It, of course, was another great victory by Daniel Ricciardo. One that even today, I could still make the argument was his best in Formula 1. Let me know, though, which Hungarian Grand Prix you think I missed from my list. Honestly, narrowing it down to 5 was rather difficult because there were a few other brilliant ones. Last year's race, there was a lot of chaos during that, and of course the McLaren rivalry that we had going on as well. But let me know down in the comments below which races you think we missed or what your top 5 order would look like. And make sure you subscribe to the channel, leave a like so we can bring you more Formula 1 content.